Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to talk diplomacy because that's what we do here in this committee. And hands down, one of the biggest things asked, I think probably to all of us, either side of the aisle, is what are you doing? We see China visits Russia, Russia pulls out of New START. We see balloons flying over America. We see China testing hypersonics. And the question constantly is, what are you doing? And one of those forms of diplomacy that we have to deal with this is the entity list, correct? I mean, that's one of the ways that we help deal with this, to say, listen, you can't get the nut, the screw, the bolt, the epoxy, the semiconductor, the pencil to draw it up if that's what we decide. You can't get what you need, China, Chinese, Communist Party company. You can't get what you need to make those things that threaten America or our allies, because we're going to put you on a list. Correct? Correct understanding, Mr. Estevez?
I wouldn't call it a tool of diplomacy, but correct understanding.
You wouldn't say, I look at diplomacy in this way, and I always ask this question is, does our support equal our policy goals? So if we're allowing somebody to get something, that's a form of support. If we're stopping them from getting something, those are diplomatic efforts, right?
Close.
All right, well, I'll take that. You said close. We'll say it's close. So, sir, Mr. Estevez, looking at those entity lists, I'll call it a form of diplomacy, whether we're going to let Chinese Communist Party entities get the supplies that they need to build things that are a threat to America, America's allies, and Americans. In order to do that, this list, how many have you published in the last year? How many have you recommended to go up to the Federal Register? I know you talked about 12 recently.
We've put 160 entities on the entity list since the beginning of this administration. That's about a quarter of the entities in the PRC. And the entity list goes back to the 90s.
Very good. So when we look at this, and I want to bring Wendy Sherman into the conversation and say, it's been the conversation, I believe, from Wendy Sherman that State agrees with the action, you guys having the end user review for that, but there's really somebody higher than you all, and that's whether it's Mr. Crittenbrink or Wendy Sherman or Blinken. They might ultimately decide if those end user reviews are going to be put into the Federal Register, correct?
There's an interagency process. We never go up that high, to tell you the truth. Only 1.1% of discussions over licenses or entity lists even go up to the Assistant Secretary for adjudication, because usually there's pretty good consensus on what goes on the list, right, based on the evidence that we have.
There's a process, but even if you all recommend that review goes forward and put it on the register, if Secretary Blinken or Mr. Crittenbrink or Wendy Sherman decide they don't want that on there, that's not going on there, is it?
The process actually flows a little differently than that.
Mr. Crittenbrink, would you like to
respond? We have the vote, we put people on the list.
Congressman, yes, thank you. I think we collaborate exceptionally well with our colleagues at Commerce, and not just Commerce, but Energy and DOD as well, who are also part of this process. And our goal is to do exactly what you've outlined. The entities list is designed to prevent China or other actors from acquiring U.S. technology inappropriately or to use for their military modernization in ways that would threaten our interests. So
let's
we're very supportive of that effort.
Question on that then.
Yes, sir.
Since I'm glad we have both of you sitting here. So how many PRC entities have passed that end user review, the committee, that have not been published yet?
I'm not aware of any.
None?
None.
Very good. That'd be great to hear. Do you want to consult with your staff and make sure that that's the case? Anybody behind you?
I don't have to do that.
Mr. Crittenbrink, are you familiar with any that Ms. Sherman might think that she agrees with the action but doesn't agree with the timing because it might piss off China?
Congressman, I would say that once a proposed entity listing is approved by these four agencies, this regulatory action in the ERC, it goes on the entity list. That is the process.
It doesn't just go there. You all have the opportunity to pull that back as higher leadership in the State Department.
I think what I would say, Congressman, is that we feel like our job, the reason why we have this consultative body is to sit down these 4 agencies and to think through all of the implications. Is this proposed action going to achieve our goals? Is it potentially going to inadvertently harm our own interests or the interests of allies and partners? We have to think through all of those things. But once we reach consensus and we vote, those actions go forward and are published on the entities list.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome.
Senator, good to see you.
You have spoken passionately, and I believe honestly, about your commitment to helping Ukraine defeat Vladimir Putin. I agree wholeheartedly that it is an important national security interest of the United States for Russia to lose. Putin is a KGB thug who seeks to reassemble the Soviet empire at the expense of American interest and at the expense of the safety and security of Americans. And of course, in China, Xi is watching closely to see how America responds to Putin's aggression. I'm deeply concerned, however, that no matter how much you may want to help Ukraine, there is something the Biden administration wants more, which is to re-enter a nuclear agreement with Iran. This administration has shown weakness on Iran since day one and continues to do so. Just in the last few weeks, there have been reports that you again waived congressional sanctions to allow Iraq to move money to the central bank of Iran, which the Ayatollah uses for terrorism, for ballistic missile development, and nuclear weapons work. Of course, that's not all Iran is doing. In January, Mr. Secretary, you publicly assessed that Iran had become, quote, Russia's top military backer. That's a quote. And indeed, Russia uses Iranian banks and tankers and planes to move weapons and to dodge sanctions. Yet the administration and the State Department in particular continue to allow Russia-Iranian cooperation out of a refusal to crack down on Iran. The Biden administration is boosting and in many cases funding both sides of this war. If you look at energy, and I want to start with this, I want to ask you about the use by Russia of Iranian oil tankers. As you know, Iran violates U.S. energy sanctions by using its own tankers, as well as a ghost fleet of foreign flag ships. You've allowed that ghost fleet to grow dramatically. The Iranians were using about 70 tankers when President Biden was elected. Today, they're using about 300 tankers. You did not sanction those tankers. Instead, the administration allowed Iran to restore its energy exports, getting above 1 million barrels a day, which is funding the regime and funding the war on Ukraine. Last month was the highest oil exports Iran has had since 2018. Now, we can argue about what that means for Iran, but I want to ask what it means for Ukraine and for Russia. Russia is now using dozens and dozens of tankers from that ghost fleet that the administration allowed to grow in violation of our energy sanctions directly to aid Putin's aggression in Ukraine. Why hasn't the Biden administration sanctioned them?
Senator, 2 things. First, going back to the first point, the symbiotic relationship that we're seeing emerge between Iran and Russia, to include the provision by Iran of drone technology to Russia for use in Ukraine, and the provision by Russia to Iran, or the threatened provision of weapon systems, including planes. This is something that we are very actively and aggressively working to break up across the government. We have gone after the drone network, working to sanction dozens of individuals.
Have you reimposed the oil sanctions?
And we are looking at the most effective way we can to
have you reimposed the oil sanctions?
At the Ghost Fleet. So we have imposed sanctions across the entire UAV network. We're looking at how we can most effectively deal with the Ghost Fleet.
Have you stopped the Ayatollah from selling 1 million barrels a day of oil?
We're working on making sure that we can do that effectively.
It was done in the prior administration. It was this administration that refused to enforce those sanctions that allowed billions of dollars to flow to the Ayatollah that's being used to attack the Ukrainians right now.
We're working every day to enforce the existing sanctions on Iran, even as we're looking at imposing new ones.
Mr. Secretary, with respect, that's not remotely true. The oil sanctions you could enforce tomorrow, but it is a political decision not to enforce it, and you are providing the funds that Iran is using to provide drones that are attacking Ukrainian military, attacking Ukrainian civilians. You said you just noticed recently the growing cooperation between Russia and Iran. If you were not aware of that 2 years ago, this administration has not been paying attention. Let's talk, for example, about Russian-Iranian nuclear cooperation. President Zelensky has repeatedly said that Russia is compensating Iran for weapons through nuclear cooperation. Last year, you signed waivers specifically related to the Iran nuclear deal that suspended congressional sanctions against Russia and Iran, conducting exactly this kind of nuclear cooperation. You recently renewed these waivers. President Zelensky is right. You know that, so much so that in your recent transmissions you wrote to Congress that previous waivers you had issued, quote, would expand Iran's nuclear programs and further deepen cooperation between Iran and Russia at a time that Iran is providing lethal aid to Russia for its use in its illegal invasion in Ukraine. But you didn't cancel the waivers. Instead, you signed them, enabling broad Russia-Iranian nuclear cooperation. Why did you sign these waivers, and why did you do so repeatedly?
These waivers have been in the non-proliferation interests of the United States, particularly to make sure that materials that Iran could use to develop its nuclear program were shipped out of Iran, and to make sure that facilities in Iran would not be developed in a way that could lead to further proliferation or the advancement of the program. In the last instance, we have narrowed the waivers significantly, again, to make sure that they're focused only on activities that actually advance our non-proliferation goals. To make sure
Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, that answer does not pass the laugh test. Under this administration, you have allowed Iran to get to the brink of a nuclear weapon. There's no work being conducted to make the program safer. Russia is on the side of Iran, and Iran is on the side of Russia. They're both against us. And it's staggering that the Biden administration would say Russia's still on our side trying to constrain Iran. You could halt this cooperation. You could halt the civilian nuclear cooperation with Russia. You could halt the oil sales. But this administration is not willing to do so because of politics. And as a result, the billions of dollars the Ayatollah is getting because of your decisions and President Biden's decisions are funding the war in Ukraine. Why is this administration funding both sides of this war?
I fundamentally disagree with that judgment, Senator. We had Iran's nuclear program in a box. Unfortunately, it got out of that box as a result of pulling out, not by us, of the nuclear agreement. As a result, despite the maximum pressure that's been exerted by the previous administration.
Would you answer the question I asked? Why are you funding both sides of the war?
That nuclear program has moved forward.
Would you answer the question, why are you funding both sides of the Ukraine war?
We're not funding both sides. We're trying to make sure, wherever we can, that we're pushing back on Iran having access to resources.
But you're not going to stop the oil sales.
We're looking at the most effective way to deal with.
Enforce the sanctions. It's not complicated.
On September 12th and November 7th of last year, I sent letters to the State Department asking for records about coronavirus research that had been funded by the State Department. The State Department refused to comply. When Assistant Secretary Sherman came, I asked her the same question. She didn't seem to be aware that you had been funding coronavirus research, but you are. And I got the "I'll get back to you" line. A couple weeks later, I met personally with you at the State Department and asked you the same question. Will you not divulge to us the records of the State Department's support for coronavirus research, particularly in China? You assured me you would help. We communicated several times over the phone with another Assistant Secretary of State who finally sent us a letter and said, no, we're not going to give you anything. So that's where we stand. And it's my question is, what's the State Department hiding? Why won't you give these records to the American people?
Senator, thank you. And yes, I appreciated you raising this when we saw each other a month or so ago. And my understanding is that our teams have been working to find an accommodation. There's longstanding practice.
We got a refusal, blanket refusal. No, they are not going to give us the records.
We cannot directly provide the
Sure you can.
unredacted cables. We have a long-standing practice with this committee about how we do
You're
things.
you're refusing to release them.
No,
It's
but I
not that
think-
you can't. There's a difference between can and may. You won't do it, but you can do it.
My hope is that we can find a way forward that answers your concerns so that you get the information that you're looking for. My understanding is that our teams have been working on that, and I commit to continue to do that so we can get you the
We're talking about unclassified material. Most of this is unclassified. And so we just had a unanimous vote in the Senate and in the House, and President Biden just signed a bill saying he's going to declassify stuff. But if you declassify it and you still hide it from the American people, that's a problem. I mean, we spend all of this time lambasting authoritarians and for lack of transparency. We have these silly networks on TV that are aligned with the Democrat Party saying democracy's under attack. Well, do you think transparency has something to do with democracy? You're refusing to give records on research. Money that went for research. We want to read the research grant proposals. We want to read what the people in Wuhan sent back to the State Department saying they did. Which viruses did they create? Because the thing is it sounds all great. We're going to identify all the viruses of the world. But part of what they do is they take a virus they found 200 feet down in a cave, and they mix it with another virus to create a virus that doesn't exist in nature because they say that's how we're going to further identify it. There's a big debate that should be had whether that's safe. To take a virus from 100 feet down a bat cave 12 hours south of Wuhan and take it to a city of 10 million. And yet you won't help us investigate this. You refuse, and it is reminiscent of the countries we criticize for lack of transparency, and yet you sit there and say you're still going to continue to reviews.
Senator, I think there are very important debates that certainly go beyond my knowledge and expertise. For example, on gain of function, that I know there's a vigorous debate about whether the risk outweighs the reward. I don't have the expertise to know that.
But how do we have oversight or investigate it if you won't give us a record?
So the program that, in this instance, USAID was involved in was not engaged in gain of function work or gain of function.
That's a debate.
But
and that's your opinion. We'd like to see the records.
So
Fauci says there was no gain of function in Wuhan, and nobody believes him anymore.
You know, again, there's I think an important debate about this. As I recall, during the Obama administration, there's actually a moratorium put on.
I know, but it isn't the debate. I don't want to have that debate with you. I only want to have the records.
Again, I believe that we can find a way to get you the information that you're looking for.
All right, but the last response we have from you is no. So the American public needs to know. I've asked many, many times. I've asked you in person. This is the second time in person. I've talked to 2 assistant secretaries of state, and the writing we get back from you is no. Not maybe, not we'll work with you, it's no. So that's
Senator,
where we are now.
No, and it's not no, just to be clear. We did reach back out to your team just as recently as this week to offer to provide all of that information in briefing form, which is to say,
which means you get to read it and interpret it and spin it, and we get to hear your spin. We don't want to hear your spin. We want to look at the doc. We're talking about grant. We're talking about grant proposals. You act as if we're talking about the secrets of the Manhattan Project. We're talking about grant proposals, and we're talking about grant updates where someone has to write in and say, "Oh, we did this experiment and this experiment. We got this result." That's what we're talking about. Same thing from NIH. Same thing from HHS. Everybody's hiding it. And it's not even really something to protect the Biden administration. Most of this stuff happened in the previous administration. But I don't get it. Why circle the wagons? Maybe there's nothing to see here, but then it makes the whole world think you're hiding something if you won't give it to us.
Yeah,
so just give it to us. It's a bunch of bureaucratic paper that we're looking to sift through to see if there are any clues, because one of the biggest clues we have that they did this is they asked DARPA, and we only know this through a whistleblower, they asked DARPA for money to take a coronavirus and put a furin cleavage site in it to make it more infectious. And lo and behold, that's what COVID-19 is. It looks just like what they said they wanted to create with our money. And we turned them down, but that doesn't mean they didn't do the research. We're looking for research like that they were performing. We're looking for something that may be in their notes that hasn't been public, that hasn't been sifted through. But what we feel is that people at State Department and at NIH and HHS are conflicted. Why? Because if you funded research that somehow is linked to the pandemic or a leakage of that doesn't look so good for the people who funded it. So we see this as a circling of the wagons and a conflict of interest that maybe there are people within the State Department who funded research who are worried that it might be linked to the pandemic. But we can't just accept your spin on it because people there may be self-interested, the people who funded the program. We're just asking to look at the data, but so far it has been no. We've had a few phone calls, but we don't want your spin on it. We want to look at the documents ourselves.
We're not providing spin. As I said, I believe we can provide the information you're looking for. We have long-standing practices and procedures in terms of actually providing documents and cables with this committee that we're not prepared to change. But in terms of getting you the information you're looking for,
and the only cables we have that are of value, we got leaked to us, or actually they were declassified by the Trump administration. Those cables said, and these were from some State Department folks, and it was amazing. And I don't actually fault anybody for missing it. I'm sure there are thousands of cables, but in 2018 or 17, they were sending cables back saying, holy you-know-what. They're over here working without gloves in unsafe conditions in a BSL-2 that should be a BSL-4, not a very safe condition, and that's why some of our intelligence people have leaned towards this coming from a lab. Why wouldn't you want to help us? Why wouldn't everybody want to help us?
I've seen those cables. You're right. They've come out, and I think what they said, at least as I read them, was that there were concerns based on State Department officials
but we only know those because someone had the gumption to declassify them. And I'll end with this because I know my time's up. Mr. Chairman, it takes one signature. He'll give all this stuff to me tomorrow if you'll sign a document because he says he won't sign it unless the chairman of a committee does it. And he's hiding behind some ruse. There is no law saying this. He could do it if he wants, but he's hiding behind some opinion that his own administration makes the rules to say they won't give it to Congress. But if you'll help me, we can get the information tomorrow. Everything he's saying won't give me, he will give me tomorrow if you'll sign a letter.
I appreciate the senator's time has expired, but I appreciate your concern. I understand that my committee counsel has spoke to your counsel this past Monday, and your counsel followed up with us today, and we are in pursuit of trying to see how you can be accommodated, and I look forward to making that happen. Senator Ricketts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. I want to start by talking about the United Arab Emirates. As you're aware, in January of January 17th of 2022, the Houthi-backed rebels, or the Houthi rebels backed by the Iranians, launched missiles and drones at Abu Dhabi and killed 3 people, injured 6 others. In our visit there last month, the number of officials in the UAE treated this like their 9/11. They said those words specifically, this was our 9/11. And what they relayed to us was that they're unhappy with regard to the administration's response, that President Biden didn't call. There was a weak response from the United States. In fact, I think it was reported later that you later called Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed and apologized for not having a stronger response. And I can tell you, a year later, they are still very mad that if you did indeed call to apologize, it did not do the trick because they are still very, very unhappy. So instead of having the opportunity to talk about how we could strengthen our relationship with the UAE and how we might be able to make sure that we've got a strong relationship versus the Chinese Communist Party, we were instead lectured about this fumbled in diplomacy. And again, this just leads to our allies in the region looking for other help. And we've seen that recently, for example, with what the CCP is doing. Obviously, we've all read in the newspapers about Saudi Arabia and Iran agreeing to establish diplomatic relations with the help of the CCP brokering that deal, which I think we all agree makes us look bad. So, first of all, let's just start with, how did it happen that we didn't call the Crown Prince and have President Biden call him? I don't expect that that would be President Biden who would be thinking those things up. That shouldn't somebody on his team be telling him, hey, you need to give Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed a phone call?
Senator, thank you. In fact, I spent, not just on the phone, I spent 2.5, 3 hours in person with Mohammed bin Zayed actually in Morocco. This goes back to last year. We had a very lengthy discussion about this moment. And I agree with you that for our Emirati partners and friends, this was a profound moment. And I certainly heard from him what you just shared, the concern that we had not adequately engaged them. Now, I will tell you that other partners in the government did reach out immediately to our counterparts, in my case, the foreign minister. If you ask the Secretary of Defense, he will tell you about the assets that we deployed immediately to bolster the Emirates' security. He'll tell you as well that the technology that was used to shoot down the incoming was American technology that we provided. Nonetheless, I'm deeply sensitive to the way this was perceived by our friends, and my own conversations with MBZ made it clear that we understood and that we would be with them and stand with them against threats to their security. Since then, we have been working on negotiating a strategic framework agreement to, in very concrete ways, address some of the concerns they have, to answer some of the questions they have about their security. And we've done a lot of work on that and made, I think, some very, very good progress. We've worked very closely together in building out the Abraham Accords. We started something together called the Negev Forum, along with Israel, with Bahrain, with Morocco, with Egypt, that we all took part in. We put something together that I think is going to bear very good results, bringing together the Emirates, Israel, India, and the United States, something we call I2U2, to jointly invest in infrastructure projects, and the first ones are going forward in India. We've made clear that in terms of some of the weapon systems that they seek for their security, we are fully prepared to move forward. These are systems that they started to discuss previously. They pushed the pause button. We said we'd welcome pursuing those conversations, including the F-35s. So I think there are a whole variety of things that are going on in the relationship to demonstrate the seriousness that we attach to the partnership and our commitment to it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and it's an important relationship. So I encourage you to continue, because I can tell you, having just been there last month, they are still not happy. This is still a very sore spot for them. There's more that we need to do to make sure we can strengthen this relationship. So, and I encourage you to figure out ways that not let this happen again to one of our key allies, where if a call from the president is going to be important, that, I view this as the State Department and you as the head of the State Department's responsibility to make sure the president's informed about making these types of phone calls. Next, I'd like to move on to the effectiveness of the sanctions in Russia. Early in February 2022, President Biden warned Vladimir Putin that he has never seen sanctions like the one I have promised to impose. And soon after Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, the West did impose tough sanctions, including measures that included the removal of the Russian banks from the SWIFT network, sanctions on Russia's central bank, freezing $300 billion of Russia's foreign reserves, among other things. And the expectation of this would cripple the Russian economy. In April, or the World Bank predicted by April 2022, Russia's economy would be contracting by 11.2%. The International Institute of Finance went even further, predicting the Russian economy would decline by a whopping 15%. Instead, the Russian economy was weakened, but it certainly was not crippled, having shrunk maybe 2 to 4% last year, much less than the 10 to 15% that people were predicting. My question is, what did we miss? First, the ability for Russians to sanction-proof its economy, as well as actions taken by the Russian central bank to implement aggressive capital control measures and interest rate hikes to prevent the collapse of the ruble. Second, Russia would still be able to sell oil that would have gone to Europe to countries like China and India. And in fact, India imports of Russian oil are up 400%, as you know. And then third, the ability of Russia to circumvent these sanctions. For example, Turkish companies exported tens of millions of dollars worth of machinery, electronics, spare parts, and other items that Russia needs for its military. Countries that border Russia, like Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, have become primary importers of dual-use goods from the West and then reselling them in Russia. And this week, the New York Times reported that China has sold more than $12 million in drones for Russia that they'll use in the war effort. So clearly we have to do better. So in March last year, you said that Western sanctions are having a crippling effect on the Russian economy. After a year of conflict in Ukraine, do you believe that these are crippling? And if not, what more do we need to do to sanction Russia?
Yeah, thank you very much, Senator. Two things on this. First, Russia did take extraordinary measures, for example, to prop up the ruble, the expenditures from its sovereign wealth fund as well to make sure it was propping up its economy. That certainly had some effect on some of the macro numbers. But as I see it, the sanctions, the export controls are having and will have an increasingly powerful effect on Russia's ability to prosecute modern warfare, to develop its economy, to progress in its technology, to acquire and use energy extraction technology that it needs, to modernize its aerospace and defense sectors. All of these things are being dramatically undercut by the sanctions and by the export controls. Yes, it is finding some substitute parts for things that are being denied by dozens of countries around the world. Those parts are inferior. It's having tremendous difficulty in replacing the weapons that it's expending, particularly precision-guided munitions in Ukraine, actually replacing those, getting the parts to do that, and a combination of things, along with the sanctions and export controls, including the exodus of nearly 1 million Russians, many of whom are the most educated, most technologically sophisticated, the fact that 1,000 or more international companies have left Russia, don't want to do business there. All of these things taken together, never mind the fact that horrifically some 200,000 Russians, by public estimates, have either been killed or wounded in Ukraine. All of these things will have growing and powerful effects on Russia's ability both to continue to have a modern, effective military and to have a modern, effective economy going forward. So I have no doubt about the powerful impact of these.
So do we need to do more, though?
We are working every single day, not just us, but in very close coordination with dozens of countries around the world. The European Union has now done, I think, 10 different sanctions packages on Russia. This is something no one would have expected. We have ourselves continue to look at the different actors that we can go after, the different sectors that we can go after to have an impact. And I think, again, you're going to see this increasing. They are having tremendous difficulty replacing the equipment that they've been using up. And they are looking, you're right, they are looking at different places around the world, but it's not at all the same as what they had before.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming in. We appreciate it. It strikes me, I know you like history. Is that your was that one of your majors? Did you study that?
Yep.
Yeah. And I think history is always instructive. One of the things that's most interesting about history is if you look back at these pivot moments in human history, the people that lived through them didn't realize that's what was happening. When you're living a hinge moment in history, you know, you're busy with everyday life and everything else that's going on, and sometimes you don't entirely perceive it. So I'm pleased, as I read the beginning of your statement here, and I heard it before I came in on the broadcast, you wrote, "We meet at an inflection point. The post-Cold War world is over, and there's an intense competition underway to determine what comes next." So it's an acknowledgement that this is not what it was like 10 years ago, 5 years ago, very different. And that's important. I would argue that we're beyond simply a competitive, and I understand why we talk about strategic competition. And I don't say this with any joy in my heart, but simply because it's sort of par for the course in human history. I think we're entering perhaps the beginning of a period of conflict, which doesn't necessarily always mean military conflict, but conflict nonetheless. We have an all-out war in Europe. That's most clearly a conflict, and it's been a globalized one. People call it a proxy war, but it's been globalized. We saw that very clearly yesterday with Xi's visit to Moscow, but beyond that, sort of the way the world is aligned in different ways. We have seen the rise of, by necessity, militarization. Germany, Japan, nothing that we're against, frankly, because given the necessities of the world, but this post-Cold War, post-World War II order in which both countries decided that they were going to be less martial, less military, necessity has changed it for both of them. A positive development for our alliance, but nonetheless a reality. We have these 9 Eastern European countries that are even more hawkish than the rest of Europe. Geography puts them right at the edge of Russia's aggression, and they can see very clearly what's happening. We have the very clear outlines of this emerging conflict. The U.S., the West, the democracies in an alliance, the China-Russia alliance, they don't want to call it that, but that's what it is, in conjunction with others like Iran potentially participating as well. And then these dozens and dozens of developing so-called non-aligned nations all trying to cut deals for themselves. We saw that with Saudi Arabia. You see it throughout Africa, et cetera. And then on top of that, in this emerging block of 2 nations, it's not simply these military alliances. We're seeing the rise of alternatives to the SWIFT banking system, to the U.S. dollar, the growth of countries that now have a vested interest in figuring out how to evade sanctions. You see supply chain diversity. Europe is diversifying where it gets its energy, and the rest of the world is diversifying because I think there's the understanding that the market is responding to the fact that we're entering a period of conflict. It is in that vein, given all of that, that I'm really concerned about whether we can continue to afford to do some of the things that we're doing. I don't mean from a dollar standpoint, but from a geopolitical standpoint. So, for example, last summer, the State Department released a report attacking the Solomon Islands for their stance on same-sex marriage. It alienated their partners there. The next week, they signed a mutual security agreement with Beijing in the Pacific, and the Prime Minister declined to participate in the commemoration of the memorial marking the Battle of Guadalcanal. That's just one example. I mean, I could take 10, 15 minutes to go through each of these here and point to different such places where we've sort of aligned ourselves in that way. Haven't we now reached a point where, frankly, we have to understand we are entering a period of geopolitical competition bordering on conflict, diplomatic conflict, economic conflict, and, God forbid, but potentially military conflict, and as a result need to govern ourselves accordingly. Not that these values or whatever our values may be don't matter, but our approach has to look very different than it did 5, 10, 15 years ago when, frankly, the U.S. was the world's sole superpower, and we had, in many cases, the luxury to be able to go through and do some of these things. Because it's not that these issues don't matter, it's that none of these issues are going to matter. If 15, 10, or 5 years from now, we live in a world in which the dominant economic, military, and technological power in the world is in the hands of authoritarian regimes who frankly resemble what the vast majority of human history looks like, and that is led by despots, where there are no individual rights, and all these things that have made not just our prosperity and freedom possible here, but the world a better place. Isn't it time for us to view the world through the lens, frankly, of the beginnings, the early stages of a geopolitical conflict?
Senator, I share your basic analysis, and I think that, in a sense, that's exactly what we're doing. We have worked from day one to do two things, foundational things. One is to support important investments in ourselves, which I talked about a little earlier, to make sure that we're as strong and competitive as we can be. And I think thanks to Congress, we've made those historic investments. And the CHIPS and Science Act is maybe the best example. But second, we have worked from day one both to re-engage, rejuvenate, and strengthen our existing alliances and partnerships, but also build new ones, new coalitions of countries and even beyond countries that are fit for purpose in dealing with different parts of the challenge that I think you described very, very well. Just to give you one quick example, when we're dealing with the challenge posed to supply chains around the world, to make sure that we have and benefit from diversified and resilient supply chains, we brought together countries in a coalition to do that, in many cases, near shore and friend shore, to have early warning systems in place if they're being disrupted, and also through something called the Mineral Securities Partnership, make sure that the United States and like-minded countries are focused on ensuring that we're able to invest in effectively some of the critical minerals that are so important to so much of what we're doing. When it comes to our engagement in the Asia-Pacific region, the Indo-Pacific, we have put that on full throttle. We've reopened an embassy, as you know, in the Solomon Islands. We're looking at other places in the Pacific Islands where we can make sure that we're present in ways that we haven't been in recent years, precisely because we are engaged in a competition. And I could go down the list of different collections of fit-for-purpose partnerships that we built to deal with exactly the world that you're describing. I do think, and you said it, that as we do that, the values that unite us are also hugely important to the strength and solidarity of these alliances and partnerships. Now, not every country that we need to be working with is in the same place that we are. I think we recognize that. And we need to make sure that we're adjusting and flexible enough for that. The last thing is this. There are a number of countries that are looking, as you know, very carefully at what's happening, making their own decisions, in some sense making their own bets about which direction they're going to go in. And from my perspective, this is less about saying to them, you have to choose, and more offering them a choice. If we're able to do that, for example, in being able to catalyze real infrastructure investment that's a race to the top, not a race to the bottom, they're going to choose us. We also have to have some strategic patience. There are countries that have had long-standing, for decades, relationships, for example, with Russia, where moving away from that, as they want to do, is not like flipping a light switch. It is moving an aircraft carrier we have to work with them to do that. But I share the basic picture that you painted, and really welcome working with you to figure out the most effective ways to deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rubio. I couldn't agree more that that's one of the core arguments for robustly resourcing the State Department and USAID is to make sure we're meeting this moment.
Thank you very much.
Chair recognizes Ms. Salazar.
Wonderful to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Sure, I'm sure you are. So, 4 countries in Latin America, and would love for you to short answers because you know we have 5 minutes. Dominican Republic. Do you think that the actual government for the Dominican Republic is racist? Yes or no?
The actual government of the Dominican Republic? No, we have concerns about the treatment of Haitian population, but the government, no.
But then, Mr. Secretary, you have told the African Americans in this country not to travel to the island, and that happened last November.
We had a security concern, and my number one responsibility, besides looking out for my own people, is looking out for Americans. We worked with the government of the Dominican Republic repeatedly, well in advance of putting that notice out, to try to address the concerns that had been raised. But we got to a point where we felt it was important to make sure that people could look out for their safety and security.
For you to put a travel ban and affect their economy, tourism specifically, you need to have some proof, and Chairman McCall and myself, we've asked the State Department to provide that proof, and you have not provided any. So, having said that, you have the power to retract that ban. Are you planning to do that anytime soon?
We will do it based on the facts. I can't, no.
Well, but that's what I'm saying. The fact, we have been asking for you to prove to us, Chairman McCall and myself, to provide the evidence that proves that the Dominican Republic government is affecting African Americans, and you guys have not provided anything.
We'll look to see what information we have that we
You don't have
share.
any because I've been asking you, and you have not provided.
Again,
your department.
These determinations are made, and we worked with the government of the Dominican Republic to try to address them.
By when do you think that you will make a decision whether to keep the ban or to retract?
It depends entirely on the facts. Whether
there are no facts.
Well, there are facts.
Okay, why don't we do something? Why don't you then provide to Chairman McCall and myself the facts that prove to you, to the State Department, that the Dominican Republic is really affecting African Americans?
By the way, it's also not a travel ban. It's an alert.
Yeah,
an alert means
it's the same effect, my friend.
Well,
it's affecting a lot of.
There were multiple cases of concern, which I'll make sure we share with you.
Please do. Could you please share that with us? Could you commit that
we will share the
the
cases
proof?
of concern that raised this?
Let's go to Cuba. There are rumors that the United States is preparing to remove Cuba from the list of terrorist states. That would mean that the Cuban regime would then have a series of more ability to borrow money, to gain oxygen for the repressive apparatus. Is the State Department planning to remove Cuba from the list of terrorist states? Yes or no?
We are not planning to remove them from the list.
Good.
Let me just be very clear.
Yes.
For the sake of clarity. As you know, there is no automatic or required review. There are a number of members who've been interested in this question. The law provides very clear criteria to rescind designations. There is an extremely high bar to do that.
So do you think that up to this hour, Cuba has met or not met that high bar?
As we speak, it clearly is not.
Good. So that means that you commit right now in public under oath that the State Department is not planning to remove Cuba from the list of terrorist states.
What I commit to is if there is to be such a review, it will be based on the law and based on the criteria in the law established by Congress. And as I said, it's a very high bar.
Good. So then I interpret that you are not thinking about doing that in the near future. Thank you. Now let's go to Argentina. You know that there is a Chinese military satellite station in Argentina. Chinese military satellite station. That sounds really scary. You know, because I'm sure that the Chinese are not looking at the stars. All right. So last month, your assistant secretary told me that he had never heard of it. And we're talking about the size of 500 football fields in Patagonia. So in 2019, I mean, that's a few years ago, the Pentagon said that that base was a threat. No kidding. It's a Chinese military satellite station in our hemisphere. Do you know anything about it?
I'm happy to follow up with you on that.
What do you
of course,
mean?
Of course, I was not here in 2019, so I'm not aware
No, I
of what was
understand,
said.
but you are now the head of the State Department,
so
and
I'm
we're
happy-
talking about a satellite station right there next to us in this same hemisphere.
So we're focused around the world, including in our own hemisphere, on any concerns that we have about the placement of...
Sir, I'm asking you, have you spoken with the Argentinians? Because you know something, the Argentinians cannot even walk into that. Could you imagine having a Chinese military satellite station in Argentina and the Argentinian government cannot even visit it? What do you think the Chinese are doing?
I welcome following up with you.
So what can we do above this?
I welcome following up with you. Thank you.
Say that again, sir.
I welcome following up with you on that.
Please do. Thank you, sir.
Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations and Related Programs will come to order. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being here today to discuss the fiscal year 2024 budget request for the Department of State, and thank you for your service to our country. And in particular, I know that your schedule in these days is rather challenging. So don't think that we don't understand that and that we take it for granted. Before I get to the budget, I want to start by raising some concerns on what I believe have been some really serious blunders that have damaged relationships with our allies and emboldened some of the most dangerous anti-American actors throughout the world. Let me just throw out some examples. The abrupt withdrawal from Afghanistan resulted in the creation of 13 new Gold Star families and the horrific abandonment of those who risked their lives to help us. And now women and girls are in Afghanistan are trapped in their homes, they're unable to receive an education, they're raped, they're maimed, they're killed, just if they dare to even attempt to leave their house or to read a book or even walk outside without a male escort. It will take decades at best for Afghanistan to regain the progress that took 20 years of hard work and blood to achieve, and I fear even longer, to really regain our reputation with those who might be inclined to help us in the future. Communist China, well, they continue to steal intellectual property. They have an expansive espionage network in the United States. They threaten its neighbors. They unleashed a pandemic that killed more than 1 million Americans with zero accountability and, frankly, no assistance in finding the origin, and continues funding its military at an alarming rate. And now we see that they are, and very publicly, they're deepening their alliance with Russia. North Korea has again resumed its dangerous and irresponsible missile tests that had been, frankly, slowed rather dramatically in the past years. After failed attempts to yet another deeply flawed Iran deal, the terrorist state of Iran is on the verge of becoming a nuclear power. And we even see that Saudi Arabia and Iran reestablished relations, and that was brokered by communist China. And here in our hemisphere, Colombia and the repressive Maduro dictatorship are deepening their relationship to the detriment of, frankly, not only the Venezuelan and the Colombian people, but also the security of the region. As you know, Mr. Secretary, fentanyl is flowing into our country at unprecedented levels and killing our youth at numbers that, frankly, are beyond alarming. And around the globe, we are giving unilateral concessions to enemies of freedom, such as diplomacy with Maduro and weakened sanctions on the petroleum industry there. Despite historic protests in July of 2021, this administration really did little more than, frankly, lip service to support them and so many others struggling for freedom from tyranny. And meanwhile, frankly, putting really pressure on our allies, whether it's the Dominican Republic or Guatemala, while doing just the opposite to the enemies of freedom. And so some might try to paint a rosy picture of what the situation is right now, but those are the facts as they are. These issues are of such great concern to me because I really believe, Mr. Secretary, and I think you do too, that American leadership remains indispensable, as do our allies and our security partnerships in helping to keep the peace in an increasingly dangerous world. At this time in history, our strategic priorities should be very clear. In Europe, I think we must continue strengthening our alliances, and one way that we strengthen alliances is by ensuring transparency, again, transparency and accountability for every dollar, ensuring the burden of jointly providing Ukraine with the military equipment and other tools that it needs to defeat Russia and to win that war. In the Indo-Pacific, we must strengthen our defense posture and really collective deterrence to advance regional peace and security, including by helping to provide Taiwan with the capabilities it needs to prevent or even defeat an aggression by Communist China. And we can't be late to that. In the Middle East, we must continue to support our strongest ally, Israel. We have to continue to degrade, or really start degrading in a much more aggressive way, ISIS, build on the Abraham Accords, and prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, and cease their practice of exporting terrorism, whether it's directly or through proxies like Hezbollah and others. Another priority must be to, again, stand up for freedom, for human freedom, and the democratic principles that we all share. It is essential for the United States to stand with those who courageously struggle for freedom, for individual liberty and democracy in some of the world's most oppressive political environments. And that includes Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua just here in our hemisphere. Mr. Secretary, turning to the budget. We are all aware of the nation's fiscal challenges, and this committee is really uniquely responsible for being good stewards of the people's hard-earned money. The President's fiscal year 2024 budget request for state and USID, I think, unfortunately, really misses the mark. The annual increases requested by this administration have been rejected in Congress, even by the President's own party, year after year. So proposing yet another large increase to a Republican House in such a, frankly, difficult fiscal environment strikes me as willfully unrealistic. But the problem is it also sets unattainable expectations abroad. In the weeks ahead, this subcommittee will scrub every line of the budget proposal to determine what funding is directly tied to U.S. national security. We will write a bill that is focused, strategic, and really aimed to addressing the top foreign policy priorities of our country. Now, respectfully, what we will not fund are controversial woke programs that tarnish the reputation of America abroad. The State Department must end its effort to export a radical political agenda on issues that, even in this country, are divisive. Not only do these programs stir controversy and division in the countries where they take place, they frankly further diminish support for foreign aid here at home. And at a time, Mr. Secretary, when, because of the situation, you're going to need all the help you can get. Mr. Secretary, in closing, I want to, again, and I mean this sincerely, and I think you know this, I want to thank you for being here. In particular, we all know your schedule right now in these days. And for your service to this amazing country of ours. And also want to thank, through you, the men and women of the Department of State for the hard work that they do day in, day out on behalf of all Americans.
Thank you for being here today. I'm going to start with the board behind me. We have a database of individuals that are coming forward to talk about their experiences with Afghanistan. A couple weeks ago, we had Sergeant Vargas Andrews, amputee, injured in the withdrawal of Afghanistan. Nobody in any agency had asked his story whatsoever, even though he was at the tip of the spear of what had happened in the withdrawal. And so we want to hear, as we are doing oversight over what happened with the withdrawal of Afghanistan, we want to hear everybody's story, any story, whether they're an SIV, whether there's somebody still stuck in Afghanistan, whether they're a Marine, a soldier, somebody that was on the wall there that was brought in to assist with SIVs, State Department, somebody that sent a descent cable. We want to hear from those individuals because it is important to us that as we do oversight over the withdrawal of Afghanistan, that we hear everybody's story, which has not happened to date. I want to start with a couple of questions, Mr. Secretary. Was Joe Biden inaugurated and sworn in as president on January 20, 2021?
Yes, he was.
And were you confirmed by the Senate on January 26, 2021?
That's correct.
And I do have a copy of your hearings. I want to reference one part of it with Senator Graham. On page 38 of it, you aptly state that any withdrawal should be based upon conditions. You can agree with that?
That was certainly the preferred course, yes.
And moving backward in time, President Trump was his team in Doha and secured an agreement with the Taliban.
That's correct.
It's been brought up many times today.
That's correct.
And that agreement, again, I have that directly in front of me. First sentence in it, peace agreement, 4 parts, guarantees and enforcement mechanisms that will prevent the use of the soil of Afghanistan by any group or individual against the security of the United States and its allies, right? Conditions.
Yes.
So President agreed there needed to be conditions. You agreed there needed to be conditions. Nearly every member of this committee so far today has asked about Afghanistan, to include yourself bringing it up. And I just want to ask right now, will you give us a commitment that you will come back here to discuss specifically the withdrawal of Afghanistan?
Congressman, we'll make sure going forward, especially as the work of this committee and other committees continue on Afghanistan, that the State Department will be present and engaged.
Will you come back and answer questions about the withdrawal of Afghanistan?
I'm not going to prejudge that. I, as you know, testified on
not a
multiple
judge.
occasions last.
Do you think that you should answer
year.
questions on Afghanistan, and will you?
I will certainly answer questions on Afghanistan one way or another, and whatever the appropriate.
Will you come
format
here in
is.
person and answer questions on Afghanistan?
I'm happy to take that up with the chairman and ranking member.
I think you answered to yourself. Will you come back here, if invited, to answer questions on Afghanistan?
I look forward to making sure that I and other members of the State Department provide the information needed by this committee on Afghanistan going forward for the work that you're doing.
I hope you do a better job at that than you have done to date. I want to move to a couple other questions. On April 14, 2021, President Biden announces the full withdrawal of all U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Do you know the date that he announced for that? That he announced we would withdraw?
I believe you. Did you just reference it?
The dates that he announced that we would actually withdraw.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes, by September 1st.
He announced by September 11.
Early September, yeah.
Not early September, by September 11. That's not just any date, correct?
I think it underscores the fact that the mission that we
He
set out to
announced we would
accomplish.
withdraw on September 11, correct?
You're correct, and I think it underscores the fact.
Let's not be
the mission that
bashful
we-
about that.
No, my recollection again had been early September. I think you're correct.
He also said this. He said, "I concluded it is time to end America's longest war." I concluded. He said it himself. Another quote from him. I called President Bush to inform him of my decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. Was it President Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan?
It was. He's the commander-in-chief.
Absolutely. I thank you for acknowledging that. I want to move to just one other question here, and this is specific to the withdrawal. On June 24 of that year, it was announced again by President Biden that we would be drawing down to 650 troops, specifically to provide security for diplomats after the main military force completes withdrawal. You understand that?
Yes, that's
being
correct.
The case? So here's my question. Of anybody that has ever spent 5 minutes or 5 hours in Afghanistan, what idiot would believe it is smart to remove the military force and leave the diplomats behind? And obviously it ended with them 50 days later having to bring back 3,000 to 8,000 troops. So what idiot decided that?
Well, pursuant to the agreement reached by the previous administration with the Taliban that called for the withdrawal of all of our forces, all of them,
What
by May
idiot
31st,
decided to pull out the main fighting force before pulling out the diplomats, which resulted in 3,000 to 8,000 additional troops being sent back into Afghanistan? What idiot decided that?
Again, Congressman, pursuant to the agreement that had been reached by the previous administration, we were to withdraw
So you're not
all
going
of
to
our
answer the
forces
question.
for,
Par for the course
from
with you.
Afghanistan.
Thank you for answering some of my questions today. I hope you'll answer more of them later.
Chair recognizes Mr. Burchett. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, many of the documents your department are providing are heavily redacted. Here's one of the documents you produced yesterday with no explanation for the redaction. I mean, that looks like the Kennedy assassination files or maybe a UFO file, honestly. I think it's a joke. Can you explain why it was redacted?
Congressman, I can't speak to that specific document. I can not even tell what the document is. I'm sure that we can, if there are concerns about redactions, raise them. We'll go over them. But I can't
I'm raising them. This one right here behind me on my right seems to be a talking points document with redacted answers. Can you give us any legitimate reason why the department redacted this information or refused?
Again, without looking at the specific document, I can't get into that.
Your State Department attorneys told the committee it should be grateful for having received any documents at all after a month, and that it was exceptional for State to respond to any chairman's letters before the committee's organizing meeting. Sir, that's an insult to Congress. It's an insult to transparency. Should be an insult to the media. I believe that Gold Star families and members of Congress and the veterans deserve these answers. Do you think your attorney's statement was appropriate in any way, shape, form, or fashion?
I'm not aware of the statement. I can't speak to it. What I can tell you, though, is this. One, I am determined to make sure that this committee, other committees of Congress, receive the information that they need, particularly to conduct oversight. Second, as a matter of longstanding practice, it's at least my understanding that previously, before committees in Congress had been organized, the executive branch did not engage with those committees. Nonetheless, despite that, we began to work on requests that we knew were forthcoming before committees were organized in an effort to get ahead of things.
Sir, I would suggest to you what you need and what you say you need is in direct conflict with what Congress is asking for. You've also stated that the climate crisis is the center of your foreign policy and national security goals. With the war in Ukraine, fentanyl from China, the tensions growing over Taiwan, of course, nuclear-armed North Korea and Iran, Mexican cartels, violence against Americans, and the Taliban controlling Afghanistan, is the climate crisis still your central policy?
I'm not aware of that particular statement. I welcome seeing it. I think the issues you've just listed, which go very much to the statement I made at the beginning of this hearing, reflect the priorities that we're focused on.
Okay. Are there U.S. sanctioned personnel in Ukraine? If so, why are they receiving our tax dollars?
I'm sorry, U.S. sanctioned personnel?
Yes, sir.
In Ukraine? I'm not aware of that. I welcome any information you have.
Okay. $4 billion U.S. tax dollars have gone to Ukrainian pensions. How is that any shape, form, or fashion justifiable?
The program, Congressman, of assistance to Ukraine has on the ground right now in our embassy about 47 personnel responsible solely for oversight. We just had a report by the Inspector General's office looking at the oversight of the taxpayers' funds in Ukraine. The report was very positive in terms of the processes that are in place and the work that's being done to make sure that money is being spent appropriately as well as wisely. At the same time, we have in place a process. For example, much of the funding that we provide, the taxpayers provide to Ukraine, goes through a World Bank program that only disperses money upon receipts for authorized expenditures. And we have third-party validators, to include Deloitte, which is working directly with the Ministry of Finance.
I appreciate all that, but when we can't fund Medicare and then we're funding Ukrainian pensions, I really think our priorities are out of whack. Let me move on if I could. A constituent of mine, Staff Sergeant Ryan Canals, he was actually the last person who was killed in Afghanistan. He was killed at Abbey Gate. Why can't his family know the full story of his death?
Again,
can somebody get with me on that? Because it's very aggravating to me. The family is they're neighbors of mine.
I deeply appreciate that, Congressman. I would refer you to, I think, other departments that would be able to.
Okay. So let me ask you one quick more question. Are you aware of Chinese spy equipment on U.S. infrastructure, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico? And what's your plan to stop the Chinese spying on domestic infrastructure?
This is at the top of our priority list, and making sure that any adversary competitor that would be engaged in undermining our cybersecurity, that we're dealing with that effectively, both in terms of our own government institutions, including my department, where we've elevated that as a priority, as well as partners around the world who, for example—
Well, what's your plan to stop it?
So we're deeply engaged with countries, including Mexico, to make sure, for example, that they do not take untrusted vendors into their communications networks in ways that could impact our security.
This is on U.S. infrastructure, not Mexican infrastructure.
Again, I'd refer you to the Department of Homeland Security, to the other agencies that focus on this. I'd also welcome seeing the information that you have. I'm happy to follow up on it.
Please have someone contact me.
We'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a letter from myself and Senator Coons. I'd like to introduce in the record about what our subcommittee's done to deal with the China problem.
Without objection.
Thank you. Secretary Austin, I've been telling my constituents in South Carolina that if we fold in Ukraine and let Putin have his way with the Ukraine, China is more likely to invade Taiwan. Do you agree with that?
I agree, Senator, and not only China, but we'll see other bad actors around the world try to do the same.
I couldn't agree with you more. So how we deal with other bad actors in the world matters. Do you believe our disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan emboldened our enemies, Secretary Austin?
Senator, as you know, there were three things that happened in Afghanistan.
I don't have time for three things. Do you believe it emboldened our enemies? And if you don't, you've missed a lot.
I don't, Senator.
Okay, good. Well, you've missed a lot. Secretary Blinken, you said a couple of months ago that China was on the verge of supplying lethal aid to Russia. Was that accurate when you said it?
It was, Senator.
Okay. We all agree we want China not to help Russia, right? Here's an idea. 100 U.S. senators recommended to you that we declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism to deter people like China from giving them weapons. Here we are, months later, and nothing's happened. And, Ms. Secretary, I like you a lot, but you're never going to designate Russia a state sponsor of terrorism, are you?
Never say never.
Well, I can pretty well say China sees all talk here. If you're really worried about China giving weapons to Russia, instead of picking up the phone and calling the Chinese, please don't do that, why don't you get 100 U.S. senators to pass a law telling China, if you give them one bullet, we're going to sanction the hell out of you.
Senator, could I just add to that, if I may?
Yes, please, very quickly.
I think China has taken account of the...
So do you think they've been deterred?
Of the unprecedented sanctions and export controls that we have wielded against Russia.
So you think making Russia a state sponsor of terrorism would not send a stronger signal to China, don't help the Russians?
I think the authorities that we have and we've used, which accomplish
well,
the same
I
thing,
just
have been very effective.
Okay,
and
let's
send
go,
a clear message to China.
Yeah, let's
as well.
go to Iran. Is Iran a state sponsor of terrorism under U.S. law? Madam Secretary.
Sorry.
Yes, I believe it is.
Okay, they're sanctioned to the hilt, right?
Yes.
Okay, do you realize that Iran's oil revenue went up 20% last month?
I know it's gone up.
Yeah, it's gone up 20% every month. Why? Because of China. So this idea that we have a strong China policy is a bunch of crap. It's not the budget will deter China. It's our will to take on people like China. So I think we're in a real world of hurt. Let's talk about the Navy. You know, the chairman criticized the House budget proposal. I, quite frankly, understand some of your concerns. A CR would be disastrous, I agree. Secretary Austin, the CNO of the Navy, said we needed 373 manned ships and 150 unmanned ships to deal with the threats we face. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware that he said that we will...
Well, do you agree with him?
I agree with the plan that the Navy has outlined.
Okay. Well, here's what the Navy said. For us to get 373 ships, what we need, I would think the Navy is really important to deter China, that we'd have to spend 5% over inflation to reach that goal. Are you aware of the fact that the budget you proposed to this committee spends 1.7% under inflation?
I am. It's under current rates, right?
Okay,
and
well, I would say that you're never going to get to 373 ships if you got to spend 5% over inflation, and the budget is 1.7% below inflation. And here's what the committee needs to know. Under the budget proposed by the president, we go from 296 ships this year to 291 in FY28. China has 340 ships, and by 2025, they'll have 400, and we project by 2030, they'll have 440 ships. So we're not doing what we need to be doing to let China know we're serious about playing in their backyard. So this idea of countering China cannot be looked in the budget vacuum, how many diplomats we have on the ground. Everything we've done in the last 2 years, in my view, has made every bad actor more emboldened. And it started with Afghanistan. And the Iranians are making more money under sanctions, not less. And China's the biggest reason we're not doing a damn thing about it. We have a chance here in a bipartisan fashion to send a signal before it's too damn late. And when it comes to Ukraine, I appreciate this committee's bipartisan action, but I can tell you right now, if the Department of Defense doesn't provide the ICC with the evidence necessary to prosecute Russians, and you're holding it up, we're sending yet another signal that we're all talk when it comes to bad actors. So you may be pleased with what you're doing, but I am not.
Senator Coons. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you all for being here. Secretary Blinken, have you ever visited any of the 15 Pacific Island nation states?
I have, yes.
They're wonderful people, aren't they?
I would agree.
And they have well-placed pride in their countries, do they not?
They do.
Right. Can we agree that these 15 independent Pacific Island nation states are just that? They're independent countries. They're not just dots that some world leaders see out of their plane windows when they are traveling to meetings elsewhere?
That is correct.
And can we agree that that China is making a concerted effort to try to bring these independent countries within the ambit of the Communist Party of China?
We can.
Can we agree that America should have a deeper... Strike that. Let me rephrase that, Mr. Secretary. Putting China aside, do you agree with me that it is the prudent and moral thing to do to have deeper engagement with our fellow countries in the Pacific, particularly in terms of trade and investment?
Very much so, Senator, yes.
Would you support showing the 15 Pacific Island nation states the respect and dignity that they deserve by creating an ambassadorship just for these 15 Pacific Island nation states to be appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the United States Senate?
Senator, something that we're looking at, but let me just put this in context. As you rightly said, these are independent sovereign countries, which is exactly why we have been engaged in a very intense effort to actually get embassies and to have ambassadors in more of these countries. And as you know, right now, we've opened an embassy in the Solomon Islands, we've opened one in Tonga, we have one pending in Kiribati, and we're also doing the same thing in Vanuatu. So having these bilateral ambassadors is critical. As you also know, President Biden...
Mr. Secretary, can I interrupt you?
Yeah, please.
I'm really sorry, but we have limited time.
Please.
And I have followed the efforts of the Biden administration in this regard. But what I'm talking about is appointing and not relying on other envoys or ambassadors. I'm talking about creating a new ambassadorship for the 15 Pacific Island nation states appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, who would spend her or his time traveling to all of the island states, talking about trade, investment, and listening.
So, Senator, I'd say two things to that. One, I think it is important that we continue to engage these countries independently, given their independent sovereign status. But to your point, and I agree, this is important, we have appointed a senior envoy to the Pacific Islands Forum. This is the main body, as you know, that brings all of these islands together. We appointed someone who's a deeply experienced ambassador.
But it's not created in law, is it, Mr. Secretary?
It's not. It's an appointment by the Secretary of State.
Okay.
That's correct.
So a new president could come in and say, we don't want to do this anymore.
That's correct.
Could she or he not?
That is correct.
What I'm talking about, if the Pacific Island countries are so important, and I think they are, and I think I've heard you say they are, let me ask you again, would you support creating an ambassador level status? I don't care what you call it, but it would be an ambassador level status appointed by the president and confirmed by the United States Senate. What's wrong with that?
I would just say, Senator, that first, the senior envoy that we have, who is a former ambassador to several of these countries, in effect, fulfills that function. So that's important.
But he's not an ambassador. He's appointed by a president. I'm talking about making this permanent.
Well, of course, a future president could decide not to appoint an ambassador at any given country.
Well, but why wouldn't you want to? Why wouldn't you want to embed this in the law and give the Pacific Island countries the respect they deserve?
I'd be happy to pursue this with you. I think what we're hearing.
I just happen to have a bill, Mr. Secretary.
Yeah, and very happy to look at it and come back to you on it.
Would you?
Yes,
I really
please
think
do.
that we have not given. I'm not criticizing you or your team. I just think that we haven't given these countries the respect they deserve, and the best way to do that would be to give them a permanent ambassador.
I think we should pursue this conversation because I'd really welcome doing that. I'm
going to put you down as a yes.
To talk about it, absolutely.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Kelly, you may want to clarify those statements because a family member serves alongside the service member too, especially a Gold Star family. And if you don't believe that, then go talk to the Gold Star families themselves because Mr. Turberville is part of that Gold Star family. And you know, comment
Senator,
there, but I'm just
Senator,
saying,
I appreciate.
No, I'm not yielding time. I'm just saying you may want to clarify that statement.
Well, I can clarify it right now.
I know, but it's my time. Mr. Chalet, you have made several comments talking about the Biden administration's withdrawal and the success of it. Obviously, I have some serious concerns about that. First of all, has anybody been held accountable for the disastrous withdrawal that took place, considering the American lives that were lost and how many Americans we left behind?
Senator Mullen, thank you for the question, and thank you for the time in your office the other week. And I genuinely,
I'm short on time. I just didn't know, has anybody been held accountable?
Senator, accountability is critically important.
No, I'm just saying, has anybody been held accountable? That's a simple one. It's a yes or it's a no.
Senator, we have tried to learn the lessons from that.
Has anybody been held accountable?
Senator, we've tried to learn the lessons from that withdrawal and apply those lessons today.
So that's a no. Is that a no? No one's been held accountable?
We have tried to learn those lessons.
So no one's been held accountable?
We've tried to learn those
lessons. Okay, so, well, it's not hard to really learn lessons, especially when you do a good debrief. In fact, when I talked to you about it in my office, you said, well, the chips need to lie where they may. That was your comments when I was talking to you about the accountability. Because if we don't learn lessons, then we're definitely determined to make those same mistakes again. Several times, Secretary Blinken and this administration lied when they said that every American that wanted out got out. Do you believe those statements were accurate?
Senator, I do.
Oh, you do? Well, then why was there hundreds of Americans that got out? And by the way, the night of the 29th, the 28th, and the 30th, I was assisting trying to get those Americans out when you guys said that every American that wanted out could get out. But the truth is, the Abbey Gate, after the bombing, HKI was closed, and you know this as a fact. No one was getting into HKI. They were getting turned away. In fact, the morning of the 30th, and this is recorded on your hotline that you set up for Afghanistan, I was asked, because I had a 3-year-old girl, plus I had Miriam and her 3 children, plus a whole host of other people that we were trying to get in. And all night of the 29th, you guys were taking me from gate to gate to gate to gate to gate to gate to gate, trying to get these individuals in HKIA. And all that had to be said was that you guys had to call over the gate and ask for them because we were dealing with the Taliban. And see, the Taliban, ironically enough, if we paid them enough money, we could get Americans out. But the State Department was stopping us every step of the way. And so the morning of the 30th, your employee at the State Department asked me personally, do you have another way to get them out? Because we've closed the airport. And so for you to sit there and say that every American wanted to get out, you're absolutely lying. And you know that to be factual, and you say it with a straight face. What's bad is that 3-year-old girl we're trying to get out died a few days later from a leg infection, and you all knew about it because I sent you pictures of it that's still on my phone, was why I said it was important that we got her out through HCI because she needed serious medical attention. By the way, this wasn't a refugee. This was an American citizen, and her parents were American citizens, and you all knew this to be factual. And then when we drive her across the country and we get her to the border to Tajikistan, your ambassador, Ambassador Promagine, which this is also recorded, told me personally, I was told by Washington, D.C. not to assist you in any way. Who told him that?
Senator, thanks for the question. And
No, I don't want to know who told him that. I don't have much time. I don't want you to try to get around it. Who told him that?
Senator, I don't know the details of
Well,
that,
the State Department said it. Has he been held accountable? Because that 3-year-old died because of her leg infection before we get her across the border.
Senator, again, I appreciate what you did to help.
No, I don't want that. I don't need that. I don't need that. I want accountability. I want someone to be held accountable. Because you know what happened after that 3-year-old girl died, and I called you guys and I said that she died? I hung up the phone and we went black as a team and we quit communicating with you. And 3 days later, you guys, the State Department, released my photo and my approximate location to the Washington Post and said I was lost in Afghanistan with a bag of cash, and never called my family to see if that was true. Never called my wife. You guys released it to a political rag, and they ran it, and they put my life in serious danger, including the entire team that was trying to get the Americans out that you guys left behind. And not one single person has been held accountable. And then when Miriam and her 3 kids from Arlington or from Amarillo, Texas, when we finally got them out across the border of Tajikistan, without your all's help, because you guys refused to help us, because you told the ambassador not to assist us anyway, Secretary Blinken, the person you was advising, goes to the podium and says, the State Department has successfully negotiated to get the first Americans out since the fall of Afghanistan. I didn't know you guys were there when she had a gun held to her hand with her 2-year-old in her arms. And she started puking because she was so scared. I didn't know you guys were helping that. I didn't know you guys were making a single phone call. I didn't know you guys were there paying off the Taliban with that bag of cash that you said I had in the hands. I didn't know you guys were there. And you're going to tell me that you can't say if someone's been held accountable or not?
Senator Mullen, your time's expired.
There's a problem here. And there's zero chance I support you moving forward.
Because, again, you have informed us you need to leave, and I want to make sure as many senators as possible have time. Senator Britt.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairman. I'd like to start by telling you and the Vice Chair how much we appreciate you holding this hearing. It is critically important that we have the opportunity to ask tough questions, to get answers for the American people, and to do our job. You allowing us to be here today will certainly make great strides towards that. Thank you both for being here before this committee. Before we start in on talking about some of the topics that we're here to talk about today, I want to make sure that we make a point on our border. So the National Defense Strategy of our nation promises that first we will defend our homeland. In order to do that, we must secure our border. When we are talking about the number of people here and the number of countries, Secretary Blinken, I'd like to add to the countries that you just said. We have people from Iran, people from Syria, people from Yemen, people from Jordan, people from Lebanon. We know the foothold that Iran has in so many of these nations. Now, these are the people that we have encountered at the border. There exists a problem that we have 1.7 million gotaways into this nation where we don't know who they are, where they're going, or what their intentions are. As we see anti-Semitic behavior rise not only across the oceans, but here in this nation, we must do every single thing that we can to keep our homeland safe, and that starts with securing our border. When we look at what's happening in Israel and the atrocities, I want to thank both of you for going and putting boots on the ground immediately, telling our friends and greatest ally in the Middle East, Israel, that we stand shoulder to shoulder with them, particularly in the face of these barbaric atrocities that occurred on October 7th. Secretary Blinken, thank you for what you just said, talking about what actually happened. I hope that every media outlet plays what you testified to earlier, and that is that we have seen men with their eyeballs gouged out. We saw children watch their parents be executed. We saw families at their breakfast table be tortured and murdered. This must stop. And in order for people in Israel to be able to tuck their children in at night, and people across this globe, we must eradicate Hamas. In doing so, we've got to take the threat of Iran seriously and what they've been doing across the globe, what they've been funding, who they have been training. You said earlier, Secretary Blinken, you agreed with Senator Graham that the normalization efforts with Saudi and Israel, that was one of the links in the chain that led us to where we are today. My question for you is, do you agree that the strategy of what I would call appeasement from this administration that occurred starting with the Obama administration now to here when it's easing off of sanctions, even offering to enter back into talks about the JCPOA, that type of behavior also contributed to where we are today?
Oops. Thank you, Senator. It won't surprise you that I wouldn't agree with that statement, even though I agree with pretty much everything you said right up to that statement. And again, I just point out that when it comes to Iran, two things very quickly. One.
And go ahead. And I know I have a limited time.
Very quickly. We've been engaged in going at Iran for its support in a whole variety of ways for malicious activities throughout the region, including support for terrorism, including destabilization. That's involved, as I said, sanctioning more than 400 Iranian entities and individuals over the last 2.5 years.
And not to cut you off, but I know that she's going to cut me off. So, in order to actually do this, we have to go back to a strategy of maximum pressure. I hope you'll work with your other countries here in G7 to actually do that. Can you commit today that this administration will not resume talks to enter in with Iran to enter the JCPOA?
Well, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals about our diplomacy. I can simply say that it was a big mistake to walk away from the JCPOA, because at least it took one problem off the table, which was Iran's nuclear program. Unfortunately, since we've moved out, Iran has turned that back on. And so that just adds to the threat that Iran poses.
Obviously, we're going to disagree on that.
One problem was a positive.
So we have one more minute. Secretary Austin, when we're looking at what is happening across the Middle East there, particularly with attacks on our troops, do you believe that Iran understands? We more recently heard this administration say that there is a red line. Do you believe that Iran understands what that red line is?
Senator Britt, we've been clear that the protection of our troops is important, and we will do what's necessary to protect them. And this activity has to change. If it doesn't change, we will respond, and again, we'll respond at a time
of our choosing. Yes, and I just want to make sure that we have we been clear with Iran what that red line is? Do they understand that?
We have been clear about what I just said, Senator Britt.
Okay.
Thank you. Senator Manchin.